My name is Madison Avery. I am 29 years old and I am a captain in the United States Army currently serving as a logistics officer at Fort Liberty, and the most dangerous battlefield I have ever stepped foot on isn't a dusty coordinate in a foreign desert, but the climate-controlled, lavender-scented dining room of my older sister Vicky's $4 million estate in Greenwich, Connecticut. They say blood is thicker than water, but in the Avery family, blood is just something my sister uses to track who owes her a debt of gratitude or an apology. I stood there in the entryway of her foyer, the soles of my polished black Bates leather Oxfords clicking against the Italian Carrara marble floors, feeling like a colonial subject visiting a tyrannical monarch. Vicky is 34, a high-end interior designer who bills her clients $500 an hour just to tell them their curtains are the wrong shade of eggshell, and she sat at the head of her polished mahogany table like a queen bee guarding a hive built on vanity and Grant's year-end bonuses. Her husband, Grant, a senior partner at Langford & Myers who specializes in corporate litigation and looks like he was assembled in a factory that produces generic Ivy League villains, sat to her right, nodding with the rhythmic, scripted precision of a robot programmed to agree with everything she said. The air in the room smelled of expensive Joe Malone with sage and sea salt candles and the faint, savory aroma of a lemon herb grilled organic chicken that probably cost more than my weekly grocery budget at the commissary. "You look tired, Maddie. Is the army finally breaking you?" Vicky sneered, her voice carrying that sharp melodic edge she uses when she wants to insult me under the guise of sisterly concern. She didn't wait for an answer, her eyes flicking instead to the $450 floral centerpiece of peonies and ranunculus that sat perfectly centered on the table, as if checking to see if my presence had somehow caused the petals to wilt. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, the defensive reflex I had developed over 3 decades of being the family's resident disappointment because I chose a rucksack and combat boots over a silk scarf and a country club membership. But I am getting ahead of myself, and to understand why I was standing there, letting my sister's words cut into me like a dull serrated knife, I have to take you back to the way things have always been between us. Vicky was the golden child, the one who received a 2024 Mercedes-Benz GLE 450 for her 16th birthday while I was told to save up my shifts at the local diner if I wanted a used Honda Civic. Our parents viewed her success as a reflection of their own DNA and my career as a confusing, slightly embarrassing phase that they hoped I would outgrow once I realized that the government doesn't provide high-thread count Egyptian cotton sheets in the barracks. As I looked at her, dressed in a cream-colored Ralph Lauren cashmere sweater that cost $1,200, I realized that this lunch wasn't about catching up or celebrating my recent promotion. It was a calculated display of dominance, a way for her to remind me that while I was managing supply chains for thousands of soldiers and ensuring that millions of dollars of equipment arrived at their destinations on time, I was still just the little sister who didn't know how to properly coordinate a tablescape. Grant shifted in his West Elm chair, the fabric of his tailored Brooks Brothers suit crinkling slightly as he reached for a glass of chilled 2021 Cloudburst Chardonnay, his eyes never leaving his wife's face for more than a second. I took a deep breath, the starch in my classy uniform feeling stiflingly hot in the meticulously air-conditioned room, and prepared myself for the interrogation I knew was coming, because in this house, every conversation is a deposition and every silence is a trap designed to make me admit that I am the one who is failing at life despite my rank and my service to this country. The divergence of our lives wasn't a sudden break but a slow, widening chasm that started in our pristine Colorado suburb, where the lawns were manicured to a 1/4 inch and the silence was thick with the weight of things left unsaid. I grew up as the disposable daughter, the shadow moving behind Vicky's radiant, choreographed glow. And even now, sitting in her dining room, I can feel the ghost of that old invisibility. While Vicky was being groomed for a life of high society functions and effortless acquisition, I was the one who learned to disappear into the background of our childhood home, a 5-bedroom Tudor that felt more like a museum than a residence. Our parents didn't just favor her. They invested in her like a blue-chip stock, pouring every ounce of emotional and financial capital into her ballet lessons and private tutors while I was treated like an overhead expense that needed to be minimized. That dynamic followed us into adulthood with a vengeance that still makes my blood simmer under my olive drab uniform. I remember my 6 months at Fort Benning, Georgia, where the humidity clings to your skin like a wet wool blanket and the red clay mud stains everything it touches, including your soul. I was dragging a 60-pound ruck through the pine barrens, pushing my body until my lungs screamed for oxygen and my joints throbbed with the dull ache of overexertion, all for a base pay of approximately $3,800 a month before taxes. Every cent of that paycheck was hard-earned, soaked in sweat and discipline, representing a life built on grit rather than birthright. Meanwhile, Vicky was busy liquidating the remains of Dad's inheritance to maintain her curated facade, spending $1,200 on a single Botox and filler session at a boutique med spa in Cherry Creek just to ensure her forehead remained as smooth and unexpressive as a porcelain doll's. She framed her entire existence around meaningless fundraisers and charity galas where the overhead costs for the floral arrangements usually exceeded the actual donations to the cause, yet she wore her philanthropy like a designer cloak. She moved into a sprawling 4,500-square-foot mansion in the exclusive Redwood Springs development, a house filled with echoing hallways, smart home systems that cost more than my car, and a kitchen featuring a sub-zero refrigerator that remained mostly empty except for overpriced alkaline water and organic greens. My reality was sharply, painfully different as I retreated every evening to a cramped two-bedroom rental unit near the base where the heater rattled like a dying animal and the linoleum in the kitchen was peeling at the corners. I didn't mind the lack of granite countertops or the way the neighbor's television hummed through the thin walls, because every dollar I didn't spend on a luxury lease was a dollar placed into a high-yield savings account for my son, Evan. He is 6 years old now, the only light in a world that often feels cold and transactional, and his future is the only mission that truly matters to me. I watched Vicky sip her wine, her manicured fingers grazing the stem of a crystal glass that probably cost $80. And I thought about the $300 monthly utility bill I had just paid for my drafty apartment and the way I meticulously track the price of milk and eggs at the local King Soopers. There is a profound, biting injustice in watching someone squander a fortune on vanity while you calculate the cost of a new pair of sneakers for your growing child, but I kept my face a mask of military stoicism. I am a captain, a leader of soldiers, and I have learned to survive on far less than what Vicky considers a basic necessity. Yet the sting of being the afterthought daughter never truly fades, no matter how many medals are pinned to my chest. I sat there, the contrast between her Redwood Springs palace and my humble rental sharpening in my mind, knowing that the real battle wasn't about who had the bigger house, but who had the strength to stand when the inheritance finally ran dry and the truth was all that remained. The precise moment of betrayal did not arrive with a scream or a dramatic revelation, but rather settled into the room like a cold draft between the main course of herb-crusted chicken and the planned arrival of a molten lava cake from a $20 slice bakery in downtown Greenwich. My iPhone 15 Pro, tucked securely into the pocket of my tactical trousers, vibrated with a sharp rhythmic buzz that signaled an urgent encrypted message, and when I stole a glance at the screen under the edge of the mahogany table, the text from a contact I had kept anonymous for months read with chilling clarity. Do not react, she is recording you right now. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird, but my military training, honed through years of high-stress briefings and field exercises, kept my facial muscles as immobile as a stone carving while I slowly shifted my gaze toward the center of the table. Hidden deep within the shadows of the $450 floral arrangement, nestled perfectly between the velvety petals of a white silk lily and a sprig of preserved eucalyptus, I caught the faint, predatory glint of a 4K microlens, a device no larger than a standard shirt button yet capable of capturing every flicker of emotion in high definition. In that instant, the entire charade of the family lunch dissolved into a grotesque theater of the absurd, and I realized with a sickening jolt that Vicky wasn't hosting a sisterly meal. She was directing a psychological thriller designed to portray me as an unstable, aggressive veteran who was unfit for the very life I was trying to build for my son. The air in the dining room suddenly felt heavy and suffocating, thick with the cloying scent of expensive lemon furniture polish and the metallic bitter tang of cheap deceit that seemed to emanate from my sister's pores. Vicky sat there, her fingers tracing the gold-rimmed edge of her Bernardod porcelain plate, her expression a mask of practiced sympathy that I now recognized as a lure. She wanted me to snap, she wanted me to raise my voice or show a flash of the temper she had spent years whispering about to our parents, creating a digital record she could likely use in her ongoing quest to prove she was the only responsible adult left in the family tree. I felt the hot, stinging bile of rage rise in my throat, the kind of fury that comes from being hunted in your own family's home, but I swallowed it down with a mouthful of lukewarm Chardonnay that tasted like vinegar on my tongue. I forced my hands to remain relaxed, resting them lightly on the table instead of clenching them into the fists that were itching to sweep her precious centerpiece onto the marble floor. I looked directly into her eyes, those pale blue depths that held no genuine warmth, and I offered a slow, deliberate smile that didn't reach my eyes but served as a perfect tactical shield. Rather than taking the bait of her previous insult about my exhaustion, I leaned forward slightly, gesturing with a polite neutral hand toward the floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over her perfectly manicured estate. I asked her about the status of her prized English rose bushes and whether the new organic fertilizer she had bragged about on Instagram was truly worth the $90 a bag she had claimed to pay. The transition was seamless, a masterclass in emotional camouflage that left Vicky momentarily blinking in confusion, her script suddenly derailed by my refusal to play the villain in her home movie. Grant continued to cut his chicken with surgical precision, his movements as soulless as the high-end appliances surrounding us, while I sat there maintaining the persona of the dutiful, boring younger sister. Every second felt like an hour as I sat in the crosshairs of that hidden lens, knowing that the woman who shared my DNA was actively seeking to destroy my reputation for the sake of her own twisted narrative of superiority. I didn't let a single tremor show in my voice as I listened to her droning on about soil pH levels and the difficulty of finding reliable landscapers in Connecticut, but inside I was already mapping out my exit strategy and wondering just how deep this rabbit hole of surveillance and betrayal truly went. That night, the silence in my cramped two-bedroom rental was heavy, a physical weight that pressed against my chest as I sat at the small IKEA laminate kitchen table, the only illumination in the room emanating from the flickering, low-resolution glow of my 5-year-old Dell Latitude laptop. The blue light cast long skeletal shadows across the peeling linoleum floor while the refrigerator hummed a low, mournful tune that seemed to underplay the absolute isolation of my discovery. On the table before me sat the birthday gift Vicky had delivered for my son Evan just 3 days ago, a sleek, minimalist LED desk lamp from a high-end Scandinavian boutique that she claimed would help him with his pre-K reading. My hands, still steady from years of clearing malfunctions on an M4 carbine, had systematically dismantled the base of the lamp with a jeweler's screwdriver until the truth fell out into the palm of my hand. It was a sophisticated Wi-Fi-enabled spy module, a wide-angle lens no larger than a grain of rice that had been positioned at a perfect 45-degree angle to monitor Evan's bed and every private moment of his childhood sanctuary. I didn't cry because tears are a luxury for those who still believe in the sanctity of the home, and I didn't scream because a soldier knows that noise only gives away your position to the enemy. Instead, I felt a cold, crystalline clarity wash over me, a hardening of the soul that happens when the person who is supposed to be your protector becomes the predator stalking your child. I reached into my kitchen drawer and pulled out a yellow legal pad and a sharpened Ticonderoga pencil, the graphite scratching harshly against the paper as I drew a single uncompromising vertical line straight down the center of the page. On the left side I wrote the word family in a cramped, fading script, and on the right side in bold, aggressive block letters, I wrote the word targets. I stared at Vicky's name as it hovered on that dividing line, realizing that she had never actually occupied the left column. She had merely been a squatter in the territory of my trust while she gathered intelligence to use against me in her twisted game of social Darwinism. The air in my kitchen felt thin and cold, smelling of the stale coffee from my morning shift and the ozone of the disassembled electronics scattered across the table. Vicky lived in a world of 4,500 square foot mansions and $1,200 Botox treatments, a world where she thought her wealth and her husband's legal connections at Langford and Myers made her untouchable. But she had forgotten that I was trained to survive on nothing but grit and a mission objective. She wanted to prove I was unstable. She wanted to capture a moment of weakness or a lapse in parenting to feed her narrative of the troubled veteran, but all she had done was declare a war she was utterly unprepared to fight. I looked at the hidden camera module, a piece of technology that probably cost her $800 at a private security firm, and I realized that blood doesn't make you family in any meaningful sense of the word. Blood is just a biological coincidence, a shared genetic code that, in the hands of someone like my sister, serves only to make you a primary witness to their cruelty. As the clock on the stove blinked 2:45 a.m., I began to list every financial discrepancy I had ever noticed in Dad's estate filings and every off-the-books payment Grant had bragged about during his third glass of wine. I wasn't the disposable daughter anymore. I was a captain in the United States Army, and I was about to show Vicky exactly what happens when you try to turn a soldier's home into a film set for your own vanity. Family is who stays when the truth comes out, and as I looked at my list of targets, I knew that by the time I was finished, Vicky would be standing entirely alone in her pristine, empty palace. The transition from victim to tactician began at a nondescript tech repair shop tucked into a crumbling strip mall on the outskirts of Hartford, a place where the neon sign flickered with a dying buzz and the proprietor didn't ask for a name or a signature on a work order. I stood at the scarred Formica counter and handed over the disassembled LED lamp along with 2 crisp $100 bills, watching as the technician with nicotine-stained fingers and a silent, professional detachment gutted the high-end spyware from the base and handed me back the shell of the gift. The $200 was a small price to pay for the tactical certainty that my son's bedroom was no longer a live feed for my sister's sick entertainment, but the real intelligence gathering was scheduled for later that afternoon in a location far removed from the manicured lawns of Redwood Springs. I drove my silver 2019 Toyota Tacoma to a satellite office building that had seen better decades, eventually finding myself in a sterile windowless conference room that smelled of scorched dregs of old Folgers coffee and the sharp ozone tang of an overheating Xerox toner cartridge. Alicia was waiting for me, her eyes darting toward the heavy steel door every few seconds as if she expected the ghosts of Langford and Myers to materialize through the drywall. She was a senior paralegal who had spent 12 years being the invisible backbone of Grant's litigation team, only to be told her pension contributions were being restructured to make room for the partners' quarterly bonuses. We sat across from each other at a table covered in a layer of fine gray dust, the silence between us heavy with the shared weight of being underestimated by people who thought our silence was a sign of weakness rather than a calculated observation. Without a word, she reached into the pocket of her tailored but frayed blazer and slid a 32 GB encrypted Kingston Iron Key USB drive across the scarred wooden surface, her hand trembling slightly as she pulled it back into her lap. "Project M," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the building's laboring HVAC system, and I felt a cold, familiar rush of adrenaline as I realized I was looking at the digital skeleton key to my sister's kingdom. It wasn't just a collection of boring spreadsheets or legal filings. It was a comprehensive digital hit list compiled by Grant and Vicky, a systematic record of every family member, business rival and local politician they had planned to manipulate, discredit or financially ruin to ensure their own ascent. The file contained bank routing numbers, private surveillance logs that mirrored the one they had installed in my own home, and a detailed map of Dad's estate that proved they had siphoned off nearly $280,000 before the ink on the will was even dry. As I sat in that depressing room, the flickering fluorescent light overhead casting a sickly yellow hue over the encrypted drive, I realized that the golden child hadn't just been lucky. She had been a predator in a silk dress, using her husband's legal access to harvest the secrets of everyone who dared to stand in her way. The air felt thin and cold as I tucked the drive into my inner pocket, the weight of it pressing against my ribs like a loaded magazine. I thought about the $1,200 Botox sessions and the $450 floral centerpieces, all funded by the systematic theft of our father's legacy and the privacy of her own sister. Alicia looked at me with a desperate, hollow kind of hope, and I realized that I wasn't just fighting for Evan anymore. I was the only person with the rank, the discipline, and the sheer lack of fear required to dismantle the machine my sister had built. Family isn't about shared blood or Sunday lunches at mahogany tables. It is a bond of protection, and since Vicky had chosen to turn her home into a surveillance state, I was going to turn her life into a tactical debris field. Would you like me to continue with the next part of the story? Opening the Project M folder felt like stepping into a cold, clinical interrogation room where the truth had been systematically dissected and reassembled into a monstrous lie designed to destroy my life. I sat in the dim light of my living room, the glow of the monitor reflecting off my dog tags, as I scrolled through 48 meticulously edited video clips that turned my most vulnerable moments into a curated exhibit of parental failure. In one particularly heinous edit, they had taken footage of me enjoying a single 5-ounce pour of Cabernet Sauvignon after a 14-hour shift and spliced it directly against a clip of me screaming at Evan to watch out when a distracted driver in a 2022 silver Lexus RX nearly clipped him in the grocery store parking lot. The result was a nauseating distortion that made it appear as though I were a drunk, abusive mother losing my temper at an innocent child, a digital assassination of my character that had been crafted with the cold precision of a professional propagandist. My breath hitched in my throat as I realized the level of calculation required to harvest these moments from the hidden cameras Vicky had planted like landmines throughout my private life. Below the video files lay a Microsoft Excel spreadsheet titled Triggers, A document so depraved it made the blood in my veins turn to ice. It wasn't just a list of my habits. It was a psychological warfare map that categorized my chronic fatigue from the Army's grueling deployment cycles as a primary asset to be exploited in a future custody or competency hearing. Every late-night yawn captured on the nursery lamp camera, every moment of physical exhaustion after a 20-mile ruck at Fort Liberty, had been logged and time-stamped with notes on how to best use my service-related stress to paint me as mentally unstable. The sheer clinical detachment of the notes was breathtaking, written in the same dry, professional tone Grant likely used for his million-dollar corporate merger briefings at Langford and Myers. They weren't seeing a sister or a sister-in-law. They were observing a target to be neutralized, a nuisance to be managed through systematic gaslighting and digital manipulation. The most damning piece of evidence was the financial ledger at the bottom of the folder, which detailed the total cost of this domestic espionage operation at exactly $12,450. This wasn't a hobby for Vicky. It was a major capital investment, and the invoices showed the amount had been laundered through her husband's firm, billed under the vague and innocuous category of consultation fees. While I was struggling to decide if I could afford the $400 repair on my truck's transmission, Vicky was cutting checks for high-end surveillance equipment and professional video editing suites to ensure my son would be taken from me. The air in my apartment smelled of the cold, metallic scent of my laptop's cooling fan and the lingering aroma of the cheap $2 ramen I had eaten for dinner, a sharp contrast to the luxury Vicky bought with the money she stole from our father's legacy. I felt a hardening in my chest, a final snapping of the tether that had kept me bound to the idea of family loyalty, because you cannot be loyal to a person who views your trauma as a tactical advantage. My sister had spent over $12,000 to build a cage for me, but she had forgotten that I was trained by the finest military in the world to break out of far worse places than a digital folder. This wasn't just a betrayal, it was a declaration of total war, and as I copied the files onto my own encrypted drive, I knew that the next time I saw Vicky, I wouldn't be the exhausted little sister she expected to see. Family is supposed to be the armor you wear against the world, but when that armor turns into a straitjacket, you have no choice but to tear it off and use the pieces to fight back. Setting a countertrap was not just a matter of revenge, it was a tactical necessity born from the cold realization that my own home had been turned into a theater of war by the people who shared my Sunday roasts. I spent 3 days meticulously installing my own suite of silent alert cameras, choosing the 2024 Arlo Ultra 2 series for their 4K resolution and infrared night vision, placing them in the recessed shadows of the crown molding and behind the ventilation grates where no amateur would think to look. I reinstalled the dummy lamp, the one I had gutted of its spyware at the tech shop, and placed it back on Evan's nightstand like a piece of poisoned bait waiting for a hungry predator to strike. At precisely 2:14 a.m. the heavy silence of my bedroom was shattered by the sharp singular ping of my iPhone 15 Pro, the vibration rattling against the nightstand with an urgency that sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through my nervous system. I didn't reach for a weapon though my training tempted me to. Instead I reached for the screen and watched the grainy, high-contrast footage as a shadow detached itself from the darkness of my hallway and drifted into my son's room. It was Grant, the high-powered partner at Langford and Myers, looking decidedly less polished in a dark charcoal hoodie and tactical gloves that probably cost more than my monthly car payment on the Toyota Tacoma. I watched through the digital lens as he moved with a practiced, predatory caution, his breath hitching in the cold air of the apartment as he approached the nightstand where the dummy lamp sat. He reached out, his fingers tracing the base of the lamp with a familiarity that made my skin crawl, and I watched as he expertly rotated the neck of the lamp by exactly 15 degrees to ensure the wide-angle lens he thought was still inside would capture a better view of Evan's sleeping form. He thought he was the architect of my destruction, a silent ghost collecting the final pieces of evidence that would prove I was an unfit mother and secure Vicky's twisted version of a family legacy. In reality, he was starring in the opening scene of my own documentary, a high-definition recording of a senior partner at a prestigious law firm committing a felony breaking and entering while tampering with private property. The air in my own room felt electric, smelling of the ozone from the monitors and the faint, lingering scent of the lavender laundry detergent I used on Evan's sheets, a scent that Grant was currently violating with his very presence. I didn't jump up to confront him because a tactical strike is most effective when the target doesn't even know the fuse has been lit. I watched him check his reflection in the window, a brief moment of vanity where he adjusted his hood, before he retreated back into the shadows of the hallway and exited through the kitchen door I had intentionally left unlocked to facilitate his hubris. He had no idea that while he was hunting for my weaknesses, he had handed me the ultimate weapon. A video file timestamped, geotagged, and backed up to 3 separate cloud servers that proved the depths of their depravity. Grant walked out of my house thinking he had won the war for the Avery fortune, but as I sat in the dark watching the playback of his silhouette, I knew that the $12,450 they spent on surveillance was about to be the worst investment of their lives. Family is about loyalty, but when that loyalty is traded for a 32 gigabytes hit list and a midnight break-in, the only thing left to do is ensure the recording is clear enough for a jury to see every single detail of the betrayal. I felt a grim, silent satisfaction as I locked my phone and stared at the ceiling. The hunter had become the prey, and the golden child's husband had just signed their collective confession in the dark of a 2-bedroom rental. The following afternoon I tracked down Brandon Kerr, the man who served as the architectural fixer for the social elite of Greenwich, a shadow operative who specialized in burying reputations and excavating enough dirt to ensure his clients always held the high ground in any legal skirmish. I found him exactly where a man of his calculated vanity would be on a Tuesday afternoon, lounging on the flagstone terrace of the Redwood Springs Country Club, a place where the membership initiation fee is $50,000 and the air smells of freshly mown bentgrass and the expensive tobacco of Cuban cigars. I stayed deep in the shifting shadows of the manicured topiary garden, my breath shallow and controlled as I stabilized a professional-grade parabolic directional microphone, the kind used by field intelligence officers to pick up a whisper from 50 yards away across a crowded tarmac. Through the high-fidelity noise-canceling headphones, I heard the distinctive clink of ice against crystal as Kerr sipped an $18 pour of Macallan 18, sitting directly across from Vicky, who looked radiant in a white pleated tennis skirt and a navy blue Ralph Lauren polo. "The custody hearing is in exactly 72 hours, Kerr said, his voice dropping into a low, gravelly register that signaled the finality of a death sentence, and I felt a cold shiver trace the line of my spine as I adjusted the gain on the recording device. He leaned forward, his polished mahogany loafers catching the sunlight, and added with a sickening smugness that once the edited video package hits the school board and the family court liaison, Madison is done. She won't just lose her son, she will lose her commission and her security clearance. Vicky didn't flinch or show a single spark of sisterly hesitation. Instead, she let out a soft, melodic laugh that sounded like silver bells masking a pit of vipers, and she reached out to pat Kerr's hand as if he were a prize-winning stallion she had just purchased. I watched her through the lens of my tactical binoculars, noting the way her $1,200 Botox treatment kept her face perfectly immobile even as she plotted the total destruction of my life and the kidnapping of my 6-year-old child. The betrayal was no longer a theory or a hidden file on a stolen USB drive. It was a living, breathing conspiracy being finalized over top-shelf scotch and overpriced appetizers in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon. I sat there in the dirt behind the thick laurel bushes, the moisture from the morning's irrigation system seeping into my cargo pants, and I felt a profound sense of tactical clarity replace the lingering pain of their treachery. They were so blinded by their own arrogance, so convinced that a captain in the army was nothing more than a disposable grunt with no resources, that they were openly discussing the details of their felony conspiracy in a public space. I had them trapped in a digital amber of their own making, the high-definition audio capturing every word of Kerr's plan to leak the doctored footage of my supposed instability to the local authorities. As I saved the audio file to my encrypted cloud server and watched them finish their drinks, I realized that Vicky's 4,500 square foot mansion was about to become a very expensive prison of her own design. Family is supposed to be the people who stand by you when the world turns cold, but as I watched my sister toast to my downfall, I knew that the only family I had left was the son I was going to protect with every tactical advantage I had earned. The countdown to the 72-hour mark had begun, and while Vicky was planning a victory party at the club, I was preparing to drop a digital bunker buster on her carefully curated life. I pulled back from the garden, my movements silent and efficient, leaving the golden child and her fixer to celebrate a triumph that was already turning into a catastrophe they wouldn't see coming until it was far too late. The grand ballroom of the Hartford Marriott was bathed in the amber glow of crystal chandeliers, the air thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the underlying metallic tang of prestige that only a room full of the town's elite can produce. Over 150 people were in attendance, A sea of tuxedos and designer labels, including the heavy hitters of the Stanton Elementary School Board and the very judges who would be presiding over my life in 72 hours. My sister Vicky stood near the podium like a seasoned predator in a $2,000 midnight blue silk gown that draped over her frame with the cold elegance of a shroud, her face a masterpiece of practiced grief as she leaned toward a local councilman and whispered about the tragic toll the service had taken on her poor, unstable sister. I watched her from the shadows of the vestibule for a moment, seeing the way she touched a lace handkerchief to her perfectly dry eyes, playing the role of the martyred guardian to an audience that thrived on the drama of fallen heroes. I didn't arrive in a cocktail dress or a rented gown. I walked through the double oak doors wearing my army dress blues, the heavy wool fabric and the sharp gold-braided chevrons providing a weight of authority that no silk garment could ever match. My medals, from the Meritorious Service Medal to the Army Commendation Medal, clinked with a rhythmic, lethal precision against my chest as I marched across the polished parquet floor, every eye in the room drawn to the stark contrast of my military uniform against their civilian opulence. I didn't wait for an introduction from the Master of Ceremonies or an invitation from the woman who had spent $12,000 to dismantle my existence. I moved with the tactical, deliberate speed of an officer taking command of a compromised perimeter, stepping directly onto the raised dais and placing my hand on the cold mahogany lectern just as Vicky was mid-sentence. The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum of sound that sucked the air out of the room as I looked down at the Stanton Elementary Board members who sat in the front row, the very people Vicky had intended to poison with her edited digital hit list. I could see the flickers of confusion and genuine fear in Vicky's eyes as she realized I wasn't the broken, exhausted shell she had been describing, but a captain of the United States Army standing in the full glory of my commission. The smell of the room changed in an instant, the floral sweetness of the gala replaced by the sharp, electric tension of a looming strike as I reached into my pocket and produced the remote for the ballroom's high-definition projection system. Grant was standing near the bar, his hand frozen on a glass of premium scotch, his face draining of color until it matched the white linen napkins on the tables. I didn't offer a greeting or a platitude because this wasn't a social visit. It was the execution ground for a conspiracy that had dared to target my son. I looked directly at the school board president, a man who had been briefed to expect a woman in the throes of a mental breakdown, and instead he found himself staring into the eyes of a soldier who had survived the red clay of Fort Benning and the psychological warfare of the Avery family. I signaled the technician at the back of the room, my voice carrying the clear, unmistakable command of a leader who has directed thousands of tons of equipment across hostile territories, and as the lights dimmed, I felt the cold weight of the Project M files ready to be unleashed. Vicky tried to reach for the microphone, her manicured hand trembling with a sudden, uncontrollable palsy, but I stepped into her path with a physical presence that forced her back toward the silk curtains. This was the moment where the golden child's carefully curated world would collide with the unedited high-definition reality of her own betrayal, and I intended to ensure that every single person in that room saw the footage of Grant rotating that dummy lamp in my son's bedroom at 2 a.m. Family is about protection, but when that protection becomes a lie, the only thing left to do is let the truth finish the job. I hijacked the gala's digital presentation system with a single practiced keystroke on my synchronized tablet, and instead of the expected military appreciation slideshow of stock photos and patriotic transitions, the 20-foot high-definition screen behind the podium flickered to life with the cold, incriminating glow of the Project M emails. The room went silent with a suddenness that was physical, a vacuum of sound so absolute that you could hear the microscopic click of a champagne bubble bursting or a single decorative pin drop on the polished Carrara marble floor. I didn't flinch as I began to scroll through the internal communications between Grant and his high-priced surveillance firm, the white background of the legal documents casting a ghostly, unforgiving light over the terrified faces of the town's elite. I paused the scroll on the most damning document of all, the itemized invoice for $12,450 that explicitly listed the purchase of hidden wide-angle microlenses disguised as children's bedroom lamps. The text on the screen was massive, the letters 4 feet tall, making it impossible for the members of the Stanton Elementary School Board or the local judges to ignore the premeditated malice staring them in the face. "Is this what family safety looks like, Vicky?" I asked into the Shure wireless microphone, my voice amplified by the 10,000-watt sound system until it vibrated in the very floorboards beneath her feet. I watched as her face, usually so meticulously composed with its $1,200 cosmetic enhancements, began to crack and crumble like ancient parchment under the weight of the collective gaze of 150 of her peers. She stood frozen in her $2,000 silk gown, her hand clutching her pearl necklace so tightly I thought the string might snap and send the beads skittering across the floor like the fragments of her reputation. I scrolled further, revealing the spreadsheet titled Triggers where they had documented my military-related fatigue as a tactical asset to be exploited in a custody battle, and a collective gasp of genuine horror rippled through the audience. The air in the ballroom was no longer filled with the scent of lilies and celebration, but with the sharp, ozone-heavy atmosphere of a public execution where the weapon was the truth and the gallows was a high-resolution projector. Grant attempted to move toward the technical booth, his face a sickly shade of gray that clashed violently with his black tuxedo, but two of my fellow officers from the local VFW stood in his path with the silent, immovable presence of stone sentinels. I looked directly at the school board president, seeing the moment his expression shifted from confusion to a deep, visceral disgust as he realized he had almost been a pawn in a conspiracy to kidnap a 6-year-old child from a serving officer. There was no way to spin this, no legal maneuver Grant could perform at Langford and Myers that could erase the digital footprints of their depravity currently being seared into the retinas of every influential person in the county. I stood there in my dress blues, the gold braiding on my sleeves catching the light of the projector, and I felt the weight of years of being the disposable daughter finally lift from my shoulders. Vicky tried to speak, her mouth opening and closing like a landed fish, but no sound came out except for a pathetic, strangled whimper that was lost in the vast, echoing silence of the ballroom. I had turned her golden life into a crime scene, and as the 4K microlens footage of Grant breaking into my home at 2 a.m. began to play on the massive screen, I knew that the Avery family legacy was being dismantled in real time. Family isn't about blood or mahogany tables or $4 million estates in Greenwich. It is about the unwavering duty to protect those who cannot protect themselves, and I had just finished my most successful mission yet. The fallout that followed the gala was not a chaotic explosion but a cold, clinical dismantling of everything Vicky and Grant had spent a decade building on a foundation of lies and stolen inheritance. I didn't wait for the shock in the ballroom to subside before I walked down from the dais and handed the encrypted 32 GB Kingston IronKey USB drive directly to the chief of police, a man named Marcus Thorne who had served as a master sergeant in the same division I had been attached to years ago. He took the drive with a silent, iron-jawed nod of understanding that only one soldier can give another, and while the gala's elite guests were still whispering behind their silk fans, the machinery of real justice began to turn with a relentless, mechanical force. By Monday morning at precisely 9 a.m., the pristine glass and steel facade of Langford and Myers became the scene of Grant's ultimate public execution as two private security contractors, accompanied by an internal compliance officer, escorted him out of his corner office in front of 40 junior associates. He didn't even have time to grab his personalized Mont Blanc pen set or the framed photo of his 2024 Chevrolet Tahoe before his keycard was deactivated and his access to the firm's servers was severed forever. Vicky's meticulously curated socialite status didn't just fade, it evaporated like a shallow puddle in a desert heatwave, leaving her exposed and utterly alone in that 4,500 square foot hollow monument to her own ego. Before the gala had even officially ended, her inner circle of friends, women who had sipped $1,000 wine at her mahogany table for years, had already blocked her number and scrubbed her presence from their Instagram feeds to avoid the stench of her sudden infamy. They tried to launch a desperate counteroffensive, filing a frivolous lawsuit for privacy violations and emotional distress. But my lawyer, a $450 an hour shark named Sarah Jenkins who specialized in high-stakes military and family law, literally laughed the filing out of the judge's chambers. Sarah pointed out with a sharp, predatory smile that there is no expectation of privacy when you are committing felony breaking and entering in someone else's home or discussing a criminal conspiracy in a public country club garden. The air in my own small apartment finally felt clean again, smelling of the fresh pine cleaner I used on the floors and the simple, honest aroma of the home-cooked meals I made for Evan, who remained blissfully unaware of the war I had fought to keep him safe. Vicky and Grant were forced to put their Redwood Springs estate on the market at a 30% loss just to cover their skyrocketing legal fees and the inevitable fallout of the ethics investigation launched by the State Bar Association. The golden child was finally seeing the true cost of her $12,000 surveillance habit, and it was costing her every ounce of the prestige she had valued more than her own sister's well-being. I sat on my modest balcony watching the sunset over the Connecticut skyline, knowing that the 72-hour deadline had passed not with my destruction, but with the total fortification of my son's future. Family isn't a biological contract that gives someone the right to monitor your life and exploit your fatigue. And as I looked at the quiet, peaceful face of my son sleeping in a room that was finally, truly private, I realized that some victories aren't measured in medals, but in the silence of a house where no one is watching. The Avery name was no longer a weight around my neck, and for the first time in 29 years, I wasn't the disposable daughter, I was the woman who had held the line and won. Today my home in Hartford has finally become a true fortress of peace, a sanctuary where the air no longer carries the static charge of surveillance or the suffocating weight of my sister's cold, calculated expectations. There are no hidden 4K microlenses tucked into the floral centerpieces on my table, no compromised Scandinavian lamps monitoring my son's dreams, and the digital ghost of Project M has been exorcised from my hard drives and handed over to the state prosecutor's office. Evan is thriving in the quiet stability of our daily routine, his laughter echoing through our two-bedroom rental without the jagged edge of my own anxiety cutting it short, and he remains blissfully unaware that his mother had to utilize every ounce of her military training to prevent him from becoming a pawn in a high-stakes inheritance game. Vicky is currently drowning in the consequences of her own arrogance, facing a felony stalking charge and a $50,000 legal bill that continues to climb with every motion her retreating lawyers attempt to file in a desperate bid to keep her out of a correctional facility. I learned through this ordeal that a tactical ambush is only successful if the target remains blind to the incoming strike. But Vicky made the fatal mistake of assuming that my exhaustion was a sign of weakness rather than a calculated state of observation. The mahogany table where she once sat like a queen bee has likely been sold to cover the massive overhead of her crumbling lifestyle, and the $2,000 silk gowns have been replaced by the drab, utilitarian reality of deposition rooms and meetings with a public defender. I reflect on the moment I sat in that sterile conference room with Alicia, looking at the 32 gigabytes encrypted drive that held the blueprint of my destruction, and I realized that the scorched earth policy I enacted was the only logical response to a relative who viewed my life as a resource to be mined. There is a specific kind of clarity that comes when you stop trying to save a relationship that was never built on love, but on the systematic exploitation of your own good nature and the trust you placed in the concept of family. My dress blues sit in my closet, the gold braiding still gleaming, serving as a reminder that I am a captain who leads with integrity, while Vicky is just a woman who spent $12,450 to prove she never actually knew who I was. The scent of my home is now defined by the simple things, like the fresh pine of the cleaner I use on the linoleum floors and the warm yeasty smell of the bread I bake with Evan on Sunday mornings, far removed from the Joe Malone candles and the cheap deceit of Redwood Springs. I didn't just win a custody battle or a legal skirmish. I reclaimed the narrative of my own life from a predator who shared my DNA and thought that wealth gave her the right to dictate my worth. Every time I look at the redacted police reports or the invoices from my $450 an hour lawyer, I feel a grim sense of satisfaction that I didn't flinch when the line was drawn between family and targets. Family isn't a biological sentence or a blood-bound obligation to endure abuse. It is the community you build with those who respect your boundaries and protect your peace. As I watch the sunset from my balcony, the sky turning a deep, bruised purple over the Connecticut horizon, I know that the battle is over and the perimeter is secure. I chose to go scorched earth because when someone tries to burn down your home while you are still inside it, the only way to survive is to make sure you are the one holding the torch when the smoke clears. My son is safe, my commission is intact, and for the first time in 30 years, the Avery family name belongs to me and the truth I fought to defend.